Hello. Wow. Left it on my phone. Yes, hello. Hello, everybody. Anybody? Yeah, so I figured I'm up doing this kind of thing anyway, and might as well do it with some company and publicly and show some of the stuff that I'm finding resonant and important in these times, and give some kind of a background to some of my thinking. I see I'm hitting my mic. Let's see. Let's go around the other way. So, yeah, like a number of documentaries or books, different works that I think describe the pressures that have created some of what we're seeing in our chaotic times and leading up to now. I find some of this stuff foundational. I've been meaning to do this for some time as well. It's a topic of interest for me, this topic, which is this documentary concerns that we're going to watch. The creation of the public relations industry and advertising, and why it was done, and who did it. And this documentary involves some of the very people who created the methods by which information is disseminated, why stories are told the way they are, why news is so truncated for the truth and business specific. And I remember it was a couple months ago, Nora brought up the subject and brought up some of the characters that are going to be shown in this documentary. This documentary is from 2002, and I was aware of it about that time. I was already a fan of this guy. And the subject material that she brought up, again, was the beginning of the advertising and public relations industry and the methods used there being very similar to specific kinds of things that would be used in Scientology, or that L. Ron Hubbard would take some of these mind control techniques and just take them off the shelf. So I've been talking for a second. I don't even know if I'm audible. Hey, y'all. Yeah, throw me a comment here or anything. Let me know that you can hear me. And I see there are a few of you in here. This little handful of people coming through. Just want to know that the audio's working pretty much. Yeah. So yeah, Nora brought up this subject, and it reminded me that I've been meaning to do this. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's good to know. And it reminded me of this interest, and so I started to gather. Thank you very much, Hillary. Reckoning with Joy. Good to see you in here at this late hour. So, yeah, and how these same techniques in advertising and in public relations are used for mind control in so many different areas. And it is of no surprise, because the creation of this industry, you'll find, involved some of the highest placed psychiatric minds of the day. So what I would like to do with anybody that's hanging out here is I'm going to put this on, and I'm going to try not to comment too much over it. I'm going to stop and say things from time to time try to point stuff out, maybe connect other things to other things, connect some of what's being said to how that could be used to a high control group or Scientology specifically. And what I would like through any of these videos, if any of you just, if you have a question, if you have a comment, if you find something interesting, I'd like this to kind of be a discussion. I find these videos to be thought-provoking, and I don't want to be holding back on the thoughts. So, okay, here we go. Without further ado, this is the first part of 4 of the documentary, The Century of Self, by Adam Curtis, that he made for the BBC in 2002. Let's see if I can get this to work. Well, all right, here we go.
He hated it. Said he wanted this stuff.
100 years ago, a new theory about human nature was put forward by Sigmund Freud. He had discovered, he said, primitive sexual and aggressive forces hidden deep inside the minds of all human beings. Forces which, if not controlled, led individuals and societies to chaos and destruction. This series is about how those in power have used Freud's theories to try and control...
Oh, I forgot. Okay, for all of you watching here, I forgot, before we go into this documentary, this is very serious stuff. This is, okay, this is very serious stuff. It's not fun. It's not light. And the imagery and the subject matter that comes up is it's disturbing. In part 2 and in part 1, I think there's some depiction of Nazis. So think, you know, nothing beyond the History Channel of the early 90s, but I mean, it goes into that for a time. So trigger warning for anybody. This is not for the faint of heart. Haggis Basher, good to see you in here. Right on. So yeah, trigger warning for sure. This is serious, mind-bending stuff, but I would say that's the best stuff. It's pretty informational, but to each their own. So, all right, continuing on.
Control the dangerous crowd in an age of mass democracy. At the heart of the story is not just Sigmund Freud, but other members of the Freud family. This episode is about Freud's American nephew, Edward Bernays. Bernays is almost completely unknown today, but his influence on the 20th century was nearly as great as his uncle's. Because Bernays was the first person to take Freud's ideas about human beings and use them to manipulate the masses. He showed American corporations for the first time how they could make people want things they didn't need by linking mass-produced goods to their unconscious desires. Out of this would come a new political idea of how to control the masses. By satisfying people's inner selfish desires, one made them happy and thus docile. It was the start of the all-consuming self, which has come to dominate our world today.
So yeah, good. I'm glad you're up, Haggis Basher, for this. Maybe you're familiar with Adam Curtis, his work from the BBC. He's been going for some time. David B., good to see you. And yeah, so already we see Siggy Freud and his nephew. Yeah, Edward Bernays, an interesting character. Wrote a book called Propaganda.
Freud's ideas about how the human mind works have now become an accepted part of society,
Wow.
as have psychoanalysts. Every year, the psychotherapist ball is held in a grand palace in Vienna.
This is the psychotherapy ball. Psychotherapists come, some advanced patients come, or former patients come, and many other people, friends, but also people from the Viennese society who like to go to a nice, elegant, comfortable ball.
And who doesn't?
But it was not always so. 100 years ago, Freud's ideas were hated by Viennese society. At that time, Vienna was the center of a vast empire ruling Central Europe. And to the powerful nobility of the Habsburg court, Freud's ideas were not only embarrassing, but the very idea of examining and analyzing one's inner feelings was a threat to their absolute control.
Interesting.
You see, at that time, these people had the power. And of course, you just were not allowed to show your bloody feelings. I mean, you just couldn't. You know, I mean, you couldn't, if you were unhappy, can you imagine, for instance, you sit somewhere in the country in a castle, you are deeply unhappy, you are a woman. You couldn't go to your maid and cry on her shoulders, or you couldn't go into the village and complain, you know, about your feelings. I mean, you couldn't, it was like selling yourself to somebody, you just couldn't, you know, because they had to respect you.
That's an interesting perspective. Seeing that seemingly psychoanalysis as practiced by these Viennese was generally practiced upon members of high society. So, yeah, hi, Sunday. So certainly she talked about, yeah, if you were some person at castle, you can talk to your maid, you can go to somebody in the village. Still, you know, this hierarchical thing, it's still hasn't reached, these services hasn't completely reached all of us yet. Just piece at a time, we're almost there. We're a lot closer than they were then, when you couldn't even talk about it.
Now, of course, Freud, you see, put that thought very much into question, because you see, to examine yourself, you would have to put a lot of other things into question, your society, everything what surrounds you. And that wasn't a good thing at that time.
Why not?
Because your self-created empire, to a certain extent, would have fallen into bits much earlier already.
But what frightened the rulers of the empire even more was Freud's idea that hidden inside all human beings were dangerous instinctual drives. Freud had devised a method he called psychoanalysis. By analyzing dreams and free association, he had unearthed, he said, powerful sexual and aggressive forces, which were the remnants of our animal past. Feelings we repressed because they were too dangerous.
Freud devised a method for exploring a hidden part of the mind, which we nowadays call the unconscious, which is a part that is totally unknown to our consciousness, that there exists a barrier in all our minds which prevents these hidden and unwelcome impulses of the unconscious from emerging. Good night.
In 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Sorry, just on the urges, that might seem really obvious nowadays. These hidden, deep, dark, sexual or violent or otherwise urges that are contained in the sub or unconscious, depending on who you're listening to. These seem like commonplace ideas that are more of the furniture of our mind and easily accepted. This is pretty revolutionary at the time, that you could say that was contained in people, and something that needed to be managed. It's how you manage it, I think. The devil being very much in the details.
Led Europe into war.
Like this.
As the horror mounted, Freud saw it as terrible evidence of the truth of his findings.
Right.
The saddest thing, he wrote, is that this is exactly the way we should have expected people to behave, from our knowledge of psychoanalysis.
Pretty bleak.
governments had unleashed the primitive forces in human beings, and no one seemed to know how to stop them. At that time, Freud's young nephew, Edward Bernays, was working as a press agent in America. His main client was the world-famous opera singer Caruso, who was touring the United States. Bernays' parents had emigrated to America 20 years before, but he kept in touch with his uncle and joined him for holidays in the Alps. But Bernays was now about to return to Europe for a very different reason. On the night that Caruso opened in Toledo, Ohio, America announced it was entering the war against Germany and Austria. As a part of the war effort, the US government set up a Committee on Public Information, and Bernays was employed to promote America's war aims in the press. The President, Woodrow Wilson, had announced that the United States would fight not to restore the old empires, but to bring democracy to all of Europe. And Bernays proved extremely skillful in promoting this idea, both at home and abroad.
So this is Edward Bernays at the center of the Wilson presidency during World War I, directing the idea of what those things were outside of what the Allied forces of World War I in Europe, that the United States was joining for 9 months at the end of the war, were really meaning to do. And they were putting forward we were going to be this savior for democracy. Interesting. Have we heard this one before? It sounds familiar.
At the end of the war, he was asked to accompany the president to the Paris Peace Conference.
Then, to my surprise,
that's the man.
They asked me to go over with Woodrow Wilson to the peace conference. And
can you imagine?
At the age of 26, I was in Paris for the entire time of the peace conference that was held in the suburb of Paris, and we worked to make the world safe for democracy. That was a big slogan.
Wilson's reception in Paris astounded Bernays and the other American propagandists. Their propaganda had portrayed Wilson as a liberator of the people, a man who would create a new world in which the individual would be free.
Still hear it about
They had
Wilson.
made him a hero of the masses.
It's not true.
And as he watched the crowd surge around Wilson, Bernays began to wonder whether it would be possible to do the same type of mass persuasion, but in peacetime.
For money.
When I came back to the United States, I decided that if you could use propaganda for war, you could certainly use it for peace. And propaganda got to be a bad word because of the Germans using it.
Damn.
So what I did was to try to find some other words. So we found the word Council on Public Relations.
Just some other word.
Bernays returned to New
Same
York
thing.
and set up as a public relations counsel in a small office off Broadway. It was the first time the term had ever been used.
Just
Since the end of the
invented it.
19th century, America had become a mass industrial society, with millions clustered together in the cities. Bernays was determined to find a way to manage and alter the way these new crowds thought and felt. To do this, he turned to the writings of his uncle Sigmund. While in Paris, Bernays had sent his uncle a gift of some Havana cigars. In return, Freud had sent him a copy of his general introduction to psychoanalysis. Bernays read it, and the picture of hidden irrational forces inside human beings fascinated him.
Yeah.
He wondered whether he might make money by manipulating the unconscious.
Hey, we're all scared of something.
What he got from Freud was indeed this idea that there is a lot more going on in human decision-making.
This guy.
Not only among individuals, but even more importantly among groups, than this idea that information drives behavior. And so Eddie began to formulate this idea that you had to look at things that would play to people's irrational emotions. And you see, that moved Eddie immediately into a different category from other people in his field and most government officials and managers of the day who thought if you just hit people with all this factual information, they would look at that and say, oh, of course. And Eddie knew that was not the way the world worked.
Bernays set out to experiment with the minds of the popular classes.
Well, just think in popular entertainments. What do people react to? They don't react to a dry recitation of the words. They don't react to something without dynamism or drama. You need to give them a story, and you need to give them some kind of an arc and something to believe in, a morality play, and you need a real bang at the end. So that's when people listen. People listen and remember when it's like a story that is familiar to us that we've heard around the campfire. So we need to tell those special internal stories to people, and we're going to get into more of that.
His most dramatic experiment was to persuade women to smoke.
Yep.
At that time, there was a taboo against women smoking.
Nora brought this up.
One of his early clients, George Hill, the president of the American Tobacco Corporation, asked Bernays to find a way of breaking it.
He said, we're losing half of our market because men have invoked a taboo against women smoking in public. Can you do anything about that? I said, let me think about it. And then I said, have I your permission to see a psychoanalyst to find out what cigarettes mean to women? He said, what'll it cost? So I called up Dr. Brill, A.A. Brill, who was a leading psychoanalyst in New York at that time.
How come you didn't call your uncle? Why didn't you call your uncle?
Siggy.
He was in Vienna.
Yeah.
A.A. Brill was one of the first psychoanalysts in America. And for a large fee, he told Bernays that cigarettes were a symbol of the penis and of male sexual power.
Yikes.
He told Bernays that if he could find a way to connect cigarettes with the idea of challenging male power, then women would smoke, because then they would have their own penises.
Yikes. Okay, I want to make it clear, I'm not a fan of any of these people. I don't think this documentary is meant to make out these people to be very, very nice. Yeah, exactly. Adam Curtis is, I mean, he hasn't completely turned the lens, but this is a very critical look at all of the work that these people did and the effects on our lives. And so the psychiatrist Brill saying this and relaying it to Edward Bernays just shows kind of the rudimentary nature of the understanding of these forces that people had, and how unknown like people's own sexuality was at the time, that they could use such base manipulation on people. Although it's kind of do the same thing now, it's just stylistically different. So don't think I'm a fan of any of these people. They are quite terrible. Edward Bernays, I think, very destructive. All of the ideas, has destroyed parts of the human society and our mind and our free will. So just with a caveat.
Every year, New York held an Easter Day parade to which thousands came. And Bernays decided to stage an event there. He persuaded a group of rich debutantes to hide cigarettes under their clothes. Then they should join the parade, and at a given signal from him, they were to light up the cigarettes dramatically. Bernays then informed the press that he had heard that a group of suffragettes were preparing to protest by lighting up what they called torches of freedom.
Oh, yeah.
He knew this would be an outcry, and he knew that all of the photographers would be there to capture this moment. And so he was ready with a phrase, which was torches of freedom. And so here you have a symbol, women, young women, debutantes, smoking a cigarette in public with a phrase that means anybody who believes in this kind of equality pretty much has to support them in the ensuing debate about this. Because
yeah, if you reflexively believe in that kind of democracy or anything, any of these slogans, any of these terms that get bandied about by people that are trying to impress upon you their view of reality and to get you to think the way that they think, they'll have you use their words in the way they want you to use them. And they just come up with things like this. And we think they come out of nowhere. No, they come out of people like Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann and other people that create the furniture of our minds without very many of us knowing. Yeah.
Torches of freedom. I mean, what's on all American coins? It's liberty. She's holding up the torch, you see? And so all of this is there together. There's emotion, there's memory, there's a rational phrase, even though it's using a lot of emotional elements. It's a phrase that works in a rational sense. All of this is together. And so the next day, this was not just in all of the New York papers, it was across the United States and around the world. And from that point forward, the sale of cigarettes to women began to rise. He had made them socially acceptable with a single symbolic act.
And he made the tobacco industry
What Bernays had created was the idea that if a woman smoked, it made her more powerful and independent. An idea that still persists today.
Embrace me, my sweet embrace.
It made him realize that it was possible to persuade people to behave irrationally if you linked products to their emotional desires and feelings.
Ricky.
The idea that smoking actually made women freer was completely irrational.
Yeah.
But it made them feel more independent.
Because they said so.
It meant that irrelevant objects could become powerful emotional symbols of how you wanted to be seen by others.
With the right story attached to it.
Eddie Bernays saw the way
and
to
people's
sell
attachment to the story
was not to sell it to your intellect, that you ought to buy an automobile, but that you will feel better about it if you have this automobile. I think he originated that idea.
Yeah,
that
right,
they weren't
Garbo.
just purchasing something, but they were engaging themselves emotionally or personally in the product or service.
You're self-actualizing all over the place with this purchase.
A new piece of clothing, but you'll feel better with the piece of clothing. That was his contribution in a very real sense.
You are better with
We
that
see it
piece
all
of
over the place today, but I think he originated the idea of the emotional connect to a product or service.
Yeah.
What Bernays was doing fascinated America's corporations.
I love these pens.
They had come out of the war rich and powerful, but they had a growing worry. The system of mass production had flourished during the war, and now millions of goods were pouring off production lines. What they were frightened of was the danger of overproduction, that there would come a point when people had enough goods and would simply stop buying.
Well, if they lasted
Up until
long.
that point, the majority of products were still sold to the masses on the basis of need.
Okay, so they kind of skip over this. All right, so in this history, they kind of skip over this bit. Before Edward Bernays got his hands on this, advertising in the United States was really basic. It wasn't a whole lot of pressure. The ads would tell you like what the thing was. It wouldn't make a bunch of exaggerated claims. It would tell you of the utility that it would bring to your life, and that's about it. Wouldn't engage you in like a fantasy or a story or a feeling or a this or a that. And the first like recognizable kind of face on a product in America that really started that thing was Quaker Oats. They were also the first ones to offer like coupons you could get some kind of a rebate on, and all the like a bunch of other tricks in advertising that kind of gets you wrapped into the brand. Quaker Oats was the first, but that was super duper tame, and they were about to kind of turbocharge it.
Goods. For the millions of working class Americans, most products were still advertised as necessities. Goods like shoes, stockings, even cars were promoted in functional terms.
It's like they
for their
heard
durability.
what you were saying, I guess.
The aim of the advertisements was simply to show people the product's practical virtues, nothing more.
Yep. And it goes.
What the corporations realized they had to do was transform the way the majority of Americans thought about products. One leading Wall Street banker, Paul Mazur of Lehman Brothers, was clear about what was necessary. We must shift America, he wrote, from a needs to a desires culture. People must be trained to desire, to want new things even before the old have been entirely consumed.
Yep.
We must shape a new mentality in America. Man's desires must overshadow his needs.
Completely. That's why we have the new
there was
model.
no American consumer. There was the
all the
American
time.
worker.
And
there was
planned
the American
obsolescence.
owner. And they manufactured and they saved and they ate what they had to, and the people shopped for what they needed. And while the very rich may have bought things they didn't need, most people did not. And Mazur envisioned a break with that where you would have things that you didn't actually need, but you wanted, as opposed to needed.
And the man who would be at the center of changing that mentality for the corporations was Edward Bernays.
Bernays really is the guy within the United States more than anybody else who sort of brings to the table psychological theory as something that is an essential part of how, from the corporate side, of how we are going to appeal to the masses effectively. And the whole sort of merchandising establishment and sales establishment is ready for Sigmund Freud. I mean, they are ready for understanding what motivates the human mind.
Yeah, to get a funnel in there for their
so
ideas.
That there's this real
crowbar
openness to Bernays' techniques being used to sell products to the masses.
Beginning in the early 20s, the New York banks funded the creation of chains of department stores across America. They were to be the outlets for the mass-produced goods, and Bernays' job was to produce the new type of customer. Bernays began to create many of the techniques of mass consumer persuasion that we now live with. He was employed by William Randolph Hearst to promote his new women's magazines. And
okay, who can tell me they just mentioned William Randolph Hearst, which is this client of Edward Bernays, who's going to create this new customer. Who knows out of y'all which movie was based on William Randolph Hearst being so very rich and crazy? Anyone? Bueller. Yes. It's an Orson Welles movie. Yo. Oh, David, they're getting there. They're absolutely. David B. I mean, well, they're a banker thought of coming up with a wants-based economy. And then you can offer lines of credit for people for things that they don't really need and that they're going to buy a new one. And then it becomes an absolute necessity, people think, keeping up with the Joneses on all the different lines. Absolutely, David B. Yes. But by the way, the movie Citizen Kane. Citizen Kane.
Bernays glamorized them by placing articles and advertisements that linked products made by others of his clients to famous film stars like Clara Bow.
Oh, wow.
Who was also his client. Bernays also began the practice of product placement in the movies. He dressed the stars at the film's premieres with clothes and jewelry from other firms he represented. He was, he claimed, the first person to tell car companies they could sell cars as symbols of male sexuality. He employed psychologists to issue reports that said products were good for you and then pretended they were independent studies. He organized fashion shows in the department stores and paid celebrities to repeat the new and essential message. You bought things not just for need, but to express your inner sense of yourself.
About to get a
others.
really bad line read here.
There's a psychology of dress. Have you ever thought about it? How it can express your character? You all have interesting characters, but some of them are all hidden.
Jeez.
I wonder why you all want to dress always the same, with the same hats and the same coats. I'm sure all of you are interesting and have wonderful things about you, but looking at you in the street, you all look so much the same. And that's why I'm talking to you about the psychology of dress.
Yep.
Try and
I
express
just shamed you
yourselves better in your dress.
by buying things.
Bring out certain things that you think are hidden. I wonder if you've thought of this angle of your personality.
I'd like to ask you some questions. Why do you like short skirts?
Oh, because there's more to see.
More to see, eh? What good does that do you?
Makes my hands look. It makes you more attractive.
Does?
Wow.
In 1927, an American journalist wrote,
all of those people were so bunged up. It makes me uncomfortable a century later.
a change has come over our democracy. It is called consumptionism. The American citizen's first importance to his country is now no longer that of citizen, but that of consumer.
That's all I see.
The growing wave of consumerism helped in turn to create a stock market boom. And yet again, Edward Bernays became involved, promoting the novel idea that ordinary people should buy shares, borrowing money from banks he also represented.
In the roaring 20s, he helped it along.
Millions followed his advice.
Before the huge crash.
He was uniquely knowledgeable about how people in large numbers are going to react to products and ideas and so on. But in political terms, if he were to go out, so I can't imagine that he could get 3 people to stand and listen. Wasn't particularly articulate, was a kind of funny looking, and didn't have any sense of reaching out for people one-on-one. None at all. He didn't think about people in groups of one, thought about people in groups of thousands.
Millions. Millions.
I would have nothing to do with it.
The power that this guy exerted.
Bernays soon became famous as the man who understood the mind of the crowd. And in 1924,
who
the president
wouldn't come to somebody like that?
President Coolidge was a quiet, taciturn man and had become a national joke.
Okay, so I say that. I say who wouldn't come to this person, and they mention another president. Sorry, all. That was stupid. Yeah, wireless mic pack ran out of battery. So, excuse me very much. Thank you for hanging in there, watching me scramble. We will do this handheld. Okay. Hopefully I'm audible again. Here we go. Loop-de-loo. Yeah. Yes, friends. Okay. Ba-ba-ba-ba-bo. Test. All right. So yeah, we were, he's going to take on Calvin Coolidge, who's become very unpopular here during the roaring 20s that Edward Bernays is spurring on. That's about to lead to a catastrophic economic collapse.
The press portrayed him as a dull, humorless figure. Bernays' solution was to do exactly the same as he had done with products. He persuaded 34 famous film stars to visit the White House.
Good to see you, Gail.
And for the first time, politics became involved with public relations.
Yeah.
And I lined up these 34 people, and I'd say, "What's your name?" He'd say, "Al Jolson." I'd say, "Mr. President, Al Jolson." Next day, every newspaper in the United States had a front page story: President Coolidge entertains actors at White House. And the Times had a headline which said, "President nearly laughed."
He loves
and
that.
Everybody was happy.
Of course. I'm happy.
But while Bernays became rich and powerful in America, in Vienna, his uncle was facing disaster. Like much of Europe, Vienna was suffering an economic crisis and massive inflation, which wiped out all of Freud's savings. Facing bankruptcy, he wrote to his nephew for help. Bernays responded by arranging for Freud's works to be published for the first time in America. And began to send his uncle precious dollars, which Freud kept secretly in a foreign bank account.
He was Freud's agent, if you will, to get his books published. Well, of course, once the books were being published, Eddie couldn't help himself but to
promote them.
Promote these books. See that everybody read them.
Everybody would.
Make them controversial. Emphasize the fact that, do you know what Freud says about sex and what he says cigarettes are a symbol of and so on and so forth? How do you suppose all those stories got out? Certainly the academics weren't spreading these around the country. Eddie Bernays was. Then, when Freud became accepted, well then, of course, to go to a client and say, well, Uncle Siggy, then that had some cachet. But notice there, first Eddie created Uncle Siggy in the U.S., made him acceptable, secondly, and thirdly, then capitalized.
I mean, maybe some of you have heard him referred to as that by psychoanalysts.
Bernays also suggested that Freud promote himself in the United States. He proposed his uncle write an article for Cosmopolitan, a magazine that Bernays represented, entitled A Woman's Mental Place in the Home. Freud was furious. Such an idea, he said, was unthinkable. It was vulgar, and anyway, he hated America.
Cool, but
Freud was now becoming increasingly pessimistic about human beings.
Dishwashers.
In the mid-20s, he retreated in the summers to the Alps, sometimes staying in an old hotel, the Pension Moritz in Berchtesgaden. It is now a ruin.
Yeah.
Freud began to write about group behavior, about how easily the unconscious aggressive forces in human beings could be triggered when they were in crowds. Freud believed he had underestimated the aggressive instincts in human beings. They were far more dangerous than he had originally thought.
After World War I, Freud was basically a pessimist. He felt that man is an impossible creature, a very, very sadistic and bad species, and did not believe that man can be improved. Man is a ferocious animal.
Yeah.
The most ferocious animal that exists.
Read there.
They enjoy torturing and killing, and he didn't like man.
Bill Hicks called us a virus with shoes.
publication of Freud's works in America had an extraordinary effect on journalists and intellectuals in the 1920s. What fascinated and frightened them was the picture Freud painted of submerged, dangerous forces lurking just under the surface of modern society. Forces that could erupt easily to produce the frenzied mob which had the power to destroy even governments. It was this they believed had happened in Russia. To many, this meant that one of the guiding principles of mass democracy was wrong. The belief that human beings could be trusted to make decisions on a rational basis. The leading political writer, Walter Lippmann, argued that if human beings were in reality driven by unconscious, irrational forces, then it was necessary to rethink democracy.
Walter Lippmann
What
is
was
a whole
needed
other
was a new
story
elite
here.
who could manage what he called the bewildered herd. This would be done through psychological techniques that would control the unconscious feelings of the masses.
See, Walter Lippmann, he worked, and they covered this before, and so they didn't really tie it in, but there's more history to Walter Lippmann being connected to all of this. During World War I, he worked in the Wilson administration, and he was horrified by the lack of control that the managers of the world had over the populations, where like the dominating myths that had been controlling most people were dissolving in their hands. The religious myths, the power myths, the divine right, all of these things were turning into air. And so they believed so many people in so many different directions believed there needed to be some new mythology, some new way of explaining, some new way of relating to that age. And because he was so disillusioned at the disorder that existed in World War I, Walter Lippmann, like a bunch of these people, had this really cynical view of humanity and believed that most people were so childlike that they needed to have world events and complicated events explained to them as if they were children, and with convenient mythology attached to it that would serve the aims of the state, which more and more became the aims of industrialists and bankers, which is what we still have right now. So Walter Lippmann, basically, to me, reading his works, he's paranoid. He's brilliant. He's one of the smartest people around at the time, but he was paranoid and misanthropic to the point where he wasn't going to try to scaffold more understanding for humanity. He was going to serve, like the rest of the public relations industry, our shortest term thinking and our worst instincts. And again, in order to sell you stuff. And for Walter Lippmann, it's selling you the idea of America and buying into the government and buying into the institutions and the myth. Walter Lippmann came up with a bunch of terms that, again, like I'm using this term a lot, the furniture of our mind. He came up with the term the Cold War and a lot of other things like that. So, yeah, here we go, Lippmann.
So here you have
got one of his books here.
Probably the most influential political thinker in the United States, who is essentially saying that the basic mechanism of the mass mind is unreason, is irrationality, is animality. He believes that the mob in the street, which is how he sees ordinary people, are people who are driven not by their minds but by their spinal cords. The notion of kind of animal drives, unconscious instinctual drives lurking beneath the surface of civilization. And so they started looking towards psychological science as a way of understanding the mechanisms by which the popular mind works, specifically with the goal of figuring out how to understand how to apply those mechanisms to strategies for social control.
And financial
Edward
gain.
Bernays was fascinated by Lippmann's arguments and also saw a way to promote himself by using them.
Yep.
In the 1920s, he began to write a series of books which argued that he had developed the very techniques Lippmann was calling for. By stimulating people's inner desires and then sating them with consumer products, he was creating a new way to manage the irrational force of the masses. He called it the engineering of consent.
Democracy, to my father, was a wonderful concept.
Yeah.
But I don't think he felt that all those publics out there had reliable judgment, and that they very easily might vote for the wrong man or want the wrong thing.
Yep.
So that they had to be guided from above. It's enlightened despotism in a sense.
Well, it's no more or less than a push that somebody will do to you at the 3-card Monte table to indicate, well, to misdirect you. It's pretty much 3-card Monte.
Their desires and their unrecognized longings, that sort of thing. That you can tap into their deepest desires or their deepest fears and use that to your own purposes.
And then, in 1928, a president came to power who agreed with Bernays.
Hoover.
President Hoover was the first politician to articulate the idea
Disgusting.
that consumerism had become the central motor of American life.
Yeah, this sounds familiar.
After his election, he told a group...
So Hoover, I mean, really, yeah, disgusting, corrupt character who did try to flip America over to the worst concerns and is fascistic in its own way, led to the Great Depression, and there were the tent cities that were set up around outside of the cities where everybody had lost their homes became known as Hoovervilles. Whoops. Here we go. Sorry, y'all.
Of advertisers and public relations men. You have taken over the job of creating desire and have transformed people into constantly moving happiness machines.
Yuck.
Machines which have become the key to economic progress.
They tell you should always be happy. Why aren't you
What was
always
beginning
happy?
to emerge in the 1920s
Ivory
was a
soap
new
would make
idea
you happy.
of how to run mass democracy. At its heart was the consuming self, which not only made the economy work, but was happy and docile.
Yum.
And so created a stable society.
Both Bernays and Lippmann's concept of managing the masses takes the idea of democracy and it turns it into a palliative.
Yeah.
It turns it into giving people some kind of feel-good medication.
Like
that
laudanum.
will respond to an immediate pain or an immediate yearning, but will not alter the objective circumstances one iota. I mean, democracy really, the idea of democracy at its heart was about changing the relations of power that had governed the world for so long. And Bernays' concept of democracy was one of maintaining the relations of power, even if it meant that one needed to sort of stimulate the psychological
By
lives of
strong-arming
the
your
public.
brain.
And
Stimulate.
in his mind, that was what was necessary.
Yeah, strong-arming your
That
brain.
if you can keep stimulating the irrational self, then leadership can basically go on doing what it wants to do.
Constant overstimulation numbs.
Bernays now became one of the central figures in a business elite that dominated American society and politics in the 1920s. He also became extremely rich and lived in a suite of rooms in one of New York's most expensive
You can
hotels,
only imagine.
where he gave frequent parties.
Oh my goodness. He had a home in the corner suite of the Sherry Netherland Hotel. And here's this wonderful suite with all these windows looking out on Central Park and across at the plaza and on the square.
Wow.
And he would use this place to hold a soiree. The mayor would come. All the media leaders would come, the political leaders, the business leaders, the people in the arts. I mean, it was a who's who. People.
Now, this is still true. This was true in the era of Mad Men. This was true in the 1980s. Advertising and public relations is a nexus point for all of these people that are seeking to have their ideas, their book, their product, themselves as an actor, a sports figure, somebody that's trying to rehabilitate their image, whatever, right? Going to basically like the Wizard of Oz or some master magician who can make your freaking dreams come true. So they think. And so people like this are able to wield power with powerful people.
Who wanted to know Eddie Bernays because, he himself became a sort of a famous man, a sort of a magician who could make these things happen.
Yep.
He knows everybody. He knows the mayor.
Everyone.
He knows the senator, and he calls politicians on the telephone as if he did get literally a high or a bang.
You would.
Out of doing what he did. And that's fine, but it can be a little hard on the people around you, especially when you make other people feel stupid. People who worked for him were stupid, and children were stupid, and if people did things in a way that he wouldn't have done them, they were stupid. It was a word that he used over and over and over, dope and stupid.
Yikes.
And the masses?
They were stupid.
Of course. Especially if you don't try to educate them. So
but
that
Bernays' power is about
clients
to be destroyed dramatically.
can have their products bought by
and by
bellies.
a type of human irrationality he could do nothing to control. At the end of October 1929, Bernays organised a huge national event to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the invention of the light bulb. President Hoover, the leaders of major corporations, and bankers like John D. Rockefeller were all summoned by Bernays to celebrate the power of American business.
It was a Tuesday.
But even as they gathered, news came through that shares on the New York Stock Exchange were beginning to fall catastrophically. Throughout the 1920s, speculators had borrowed billions of dollars.
Oh,
the banks
wow.
had promoted the idea that this was a new era where market crashes were a thing of the past.
Just won't happen.
But they were wrong. What was about to happen was the biggest stock market crash in history.
It's exactly the same thing that they were saying 2 years before the Great Recession in 2008. In 2006, if you go back and you look at the business news folk and the financial news folk, they were all talking about the housing market just not ever decreasing, just it constantly going up, when it was just a known thing that housing prices were on a 10 to 15 year cycle, and that they hadn't done anything to alleviate the eventual market correction, and that it was going to come. And generally, pride goeth before a fall. This sounds like hubris. Let's not have this hubris. I think we have it, though.
Investors had panicked and begun to sell in a blind, relentless fury that no reassurance by bankers or politicians could halt.
How could it?
And on the 29th of October 1929, the market collapsed. The effect of the crash on the American economy was disastrous. Faced with recession and unemployment, millions of American workers stopped buying goods they didn't need. The consumer boom that Bernays had done so much to engineer disappeared, and he and the profession of public relations fell from favor. Bernays' brief moment of power seemed to be over.
Just give it a second. People still need to buy stuff somewhere. They're not just going to buy it on their own.
The effect of the Wall Street crash on Europe was also catastrophic. It intensified the growing economic and political crisis in the new democracies. In both Germany and Austria, there were violent street battles between the armed wings of different political parties.
Oh, this looks familiar too.
Against this backdrop, Freud, who was suffering from cancer of the jaw, retreated yet again to the Alps. He wrote a book called Civilization and Its Discontents. It was a powerful attack on the idea that civilization was an expression of human progress. Instead, Freud argued, civilization had actually been constructed to control the dangerous animal forces inside human beings. What was implicit in Freud's argument was that the ideal of individual freedom, which was at the heart of democracy, was impossible. Human beings could never be allowed to truly express themselves because it was too dangerous.
Now, Freud was a very brilliant person for his time, but I think this is, although there is some truth to this idea, I think there's a huge misconception. People couldn't be allowed to fully express themselves because it's too dangerous. In what context, for what reason? You know, it might be too dangerous for you in the context of like Viennese high society, or, you know, the kind of cloistered academic confines that he might find himself in. But yeah, no, for what reason, in what context, where? These universal statements kind of smack of ideological leanings, which to me do not indicate thinking.
They must always be controlled and would thus
indicates fear
always be discontent.
To me.
Man doesn't want to be civilized, and he is, civilization brings discontent, but it's necessary to survival. Otherwise he couldn't survive. So he must be discontent, because this would be the only way to keep him within limits.
But what did Freud think about the idea of the equality of man?
He didn't believe in it.
We had 32 parties, and Hitler said, before those parties don't vanish, there is no Germany. That's
okay, so we're about to get into the Nazi side of it all. Just a warning, a trigger warning for anybody. We're going to talk about Nazis and Nazism and the psychological underpinnings thereof. It's not fun. Triggering for some people might not want to be here for this. Here we go.
True. You can't have 32 parties. And so they felt this one person will put an end to this comedy.
Freud was not alone in his pessimism. Politicians like Adolf Hitler emerged from a growing despair in the 1920s about democracy. The Nazis were convinced that democracy was dangerous because it unleashed a selfish individualism, but didn't have the means to control it. Hitler's party, the National Socialists, stood in elections, promising in their propaganda that they would abandon democracy because of the chaos and unemployment it led to.
Die Parteien versprachen den Himmel auf Erden.
In March 1933, the National Socialists were elected to power in Germany.
Frightening.
And they set out to create a society that would control human beings in a different way. One of their first acts was to take control of business.
Total way.
The planning of production would in future be done by the state. The free market was too unstable, as the crash in America had proved.
Well, it's kind of reminiscent of the boat parades in Florida, I guess.
Through a new organization called Strength Through Joy. One of its mottos was service, not self.
Might get some of that coming up.
But the Nazis did not see this as a return to an old form of autocratic control. It was a new alternative to democracy, in which the feelings and the desires of the masses would still be central, but they would be channeled in such a way as to bind the nation together.
Nice one, Night Train.
Chief exponent of this was Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda.
Yep.
Es mag gut sein, Macht zu besitzen, die auf Gewehren ruht. Besser aber und beglückender ist es, das Herz eines Volkes zu gewinnen und es auch zu behalten.
Yeah, gross.
Goebbels organized huge rallies whose function, he said, was to forge the mind of the nation into a unity of thinking, feeling, and desire. One of his inspirations, he told an American journalist, was the writings of Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays.
I mean, they loved a lot of things American. This guy, Joe, Adolf, in the finally verified part 2 to Mein Kampf that was unearthed, and there is a huge controversy as to whether or not it was authentic, and it was authenticated, and within it, it contained invasion of the United States, but a whole lot of praise, and in a lot of their writings, a lot of praise for how the United States controlled people through this market economy stuff and through Eddie Bernays. That it is the claim that they're about, well, that Adam Curtis is about to go through is definitely backed up by other writing.
In his work on crowd psychology, Freud described how the frightening irrationality inside human beings could emerge in such groups.
Yeah.
The deep, what he called libidinal forces of desire,
but they
were given up to the leader, while the aggressive instincts are unleashed on those outside the group.
Yeah.
Freud wrote this as a warning, but the Nazis were deliberately encouraging these forces.
Yeah, they wanted to use it as a tool.
Master and control.
They're like, oh, really? It was like Freud said, this tool, like this router or something, this is really dangerous. It could hurt a lot of people. And they picked it up and like, okay, we're going to make all of the furniture out of it. Thank you.
Well, Freud was saying that masses are bound by libidinal forces. They love each other and delegate their ideas and their feelings to the chap on top.
What are libidinal forces? What are libidinal forces?
Well, forces of love.
The libido, libidinal libido.
Okay. Hate is delegated to the others outside.
Just disgusting.
It's the mob.
Yeah, the disgusting way people think in groups that leads to this kind of stuff.
I could see from afar, looking up Wilhelmstraße towards Unter den Linden, how those 100,000 of people, when they passed Hitler, they just became completely delirious. They began to shout these cries I will never get out of my ears. Heil, Sieg, Heil. They demented.
Yeah.
And here I got confirmation how those irrational forces, uncontrollable forces in Germany, in the Germans, had erupted, had broken out, were running riot, were departing, marching on.
Seems like we got a little bit of this running around. These libidinal, violent, primal forces.
And in America too, democracy was under threat from the force of the angry mob. The effect of the stock market crash had been disastrous. There was growing violence as an angry population took out their frustration on the corporations who were seen to have caused this disaster. Then, in 1932, a new president was elected who was also going to use the power of the state to control the free market. But his aim was not to destroy democracy, but to strengthen it. And to do this, he was going to develop a new way of dealing with the masses.
I am prepared, under my constitutional duty, to recommend the measures that a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world may require. But in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis: broad executive power.
The broadest. He remade the country.
It was the start of what would become known as the New Deal.
Yeah.
Roosevelt assembled a group of young technocrats and planners in Washington. he told them that their job was to plan and run giant new industrial projects for the good of the nation.
Who'd have thunk it?
Roosevelt was convinced that the stock market crash had shown that laissez-faire capitalism could no longer run modern industrial economies.
But we didn't
It
learn
would become
the
the job
lesson.
of government.
They
Big
insisted
business was
after he
horrified,
was dead that it was the
but the New
only
Deal
way
attracted
ever
the admiration of the
for the
Nazis,
rest of the time.
especially Joseph Goebbels.
Yeah, he loved it.
Wir betrachten die wirtschaftliche Entwicklung in Amerika mit dem allergrößten positiven Interesse. Und wir sind dort der festen Überzeugung, dass Präsident Roosevelt und seine Berater auf dem richtigen Wege sind. Es handelt sich in der Tat um das größte wirtschaftliche und soziale Problem aller Zeiten. Die vielen Millionen Arbeitslosen, die ihre Plätze an den Maschinen und in den Kontoren verloren haben, wieder an ihre alten Arbeitsstellen zurückzuführen. Das kann nicht allein der privaten Initiative überlassen werden. Ausschlaggebend ist, dass die öffentliche Hand mit positiven Maßnahmen eingreift.
Yeah.
But although Roosevelt, like the
Hard
Nazis, was
to
trying
take
to
anything
organize
he says.
society in a different way, unlike the Nazis, he believed that human beings
Just
were
to
rational
listen.
and could be trusted to
Real
take
hard.
an active part in government. Roosevelt believed it was possible to explain his policies to ordinary Americans and take into account their opinions. To do this, he was helped by the new ideas of an American social scientist called George Gallup.
Heard of that? Heard of that
Favorite
person?
reading of New Deal Washington,
Heard of
the
a
survey
Gallup
of
poll?
U.S. public opinion. From offices at Princeton, New Jersey, a famed statistician, Dr. George Gallup, tells Washington from week to week what the nation is thinking. And in New York, Fortune magazine's analyst, Elmo Roper, compiles for publication a continuous record of the nation's approval or disapproval of how the country is being run.
Gallup and Roper rejected Bernays' view that human beings were at the mercy of unconscious forces and so needed to be controlled. Their system of opinion polling was based on the idea that people could be trusted to know what they wanted. They argued that one could measure and predict the opinions and behavior of the public if one asked strictly factual questions and avoided manipulating their emotions.
Yeah, but do any of us really
how
know
about
what
this
we
one?
want?
Do you think Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal has been bad for the nation in general?
No, that question's loaded. It automatically suggests an answer. Well, how about this? Is your present feeling toward President Roosevelt one of general approval or general disapproval? That's better.
By George, they gave
Prior
the
to
guy
scientific polling,
3 sheets
the
a
view
line.
of many people was that you couldn't trust
the
public
wind.
opinion. It was irrational. That it was ill-informed, chaotic, unruly, and so forth. And so that opinion should be dismissed. But with scientific polling, I think it established very clearly that people are rational, that they do make good decisions, and this offers democracy a chance to be truly informed by the public, giving everybody a voice in the way the country is run. I know my father wouldn't necessarily say the voice of the public is the voice of God, but he did feel very much that the voice of the people is a rational voice and should be heard.
Yeah, ish.
What Roosevelt
At
was doing was
times,
forging a new
and again,
connection between the
it
masses and
depends.
politicians. No longer were they irrational consumers who were managed by
Sorry, guys.
suiting their desires. Instead, they were sensible citizens who could take part in the governing of the country. In 1936, Roosevelt stood for re-election. He promised further control over big business.
I thought it was over
To
there.
the
I'm
corporations,
still
it
looking
was
for
the
this
beginning
Walter
of a
Lippmann book.
dictatorship.
Roosevelt interferes with private enterprise.
He sure does.
And is running the country into debt for generations to come. The way to get recovery is to let business alone.
But Roosevelt was
kicked off
triumphantly
the
re-elected.
longest period of prosperity in American history for sure.
This time. So please let me thank you again and tell you that I hope to see you all very soon and bid you an affectionate good night.
Faced with this, business now decided to fight back, to regain power in America. At the heart of the battle would be Edward Bernays and the profession he had invented, public relations.
Following that election, business people start to get together and start to carry on discussions, primarily in private, and they start talking to each other about the need to sort of carry on ideological warfare against the New Deal.
It's still
and
happening.
to sort of reassert the sort of connectedness between the idea of democracy on the one hand.
This war started then between the crazy capitalists of the time and of now, and of almost any attempt to provide a public good to anyone through the government. This ideological fight, you can hear it come out of the mouths of nearly every Republican congressperson, House member, and senator who is elected today, who is elected and paid, bought and paid for by these same interests and represents them exclusively. Now, much of the Democratic Party does as well, represents very many moneyed interests. But at the very least, they make promises to the American people on deliverables for social goods for the Commonwealth. And at times, if you hold their feet to the fire and you embarrass them, they deliver. But yes, this fight started at the inception of the New Deal, and they've been trying to tear down every last piece of it brick by brick ever since. And they've pretty much done it.
And the idea of privately owned business on the other. And so, under the umbrella of an organization which still exists, which is called the National Association of Manufacturers, and whose membership included all of the major corporations of the United States, a campaign is launched explicitly designed to create emotional attachments between the public and big business. It's Bernays' techniques being
Carnation Instant Breakfast. Oh yeah, here we go.
General Motors
Some
Parade
corporate
of Progress,
porn.
traveling the high roads and byroads of America.
They're going to
bringing
get
to millions
real
of Americans
mythological
in
here.
their own hometown the fascinating story behind modern industry.
The campaign set out to show dramatically that it was business, not politicians, who had created modern America.
Yeah.
Of living for all of
That's what Epcot was trying to do, the World's Fair.
Bernays was an advisor to General Motors, but he was no longer alone. The industry he had founded now flourished as hundreds of public relations advisors organized a vast campaign. They not only used advertisements and billboards, but managed to insinuate their message into the editorial pages of the newspapers. It became a bitter fight. In response to the campaign, the government made films that warned of the unscrupulous manipulation of the press by big business. And the central villain was the new figure of the public relations man.
They tried to achieve their ends by working entirely behind the scenes, corrupting and deceiving the public. The aims of such groups may be either good or bad, so far as the public interest is concerned, but their methods are a grave danger to democratic institutions.
The films also showed how the responsible citizen could monitor the press themselves. They could create a chart that analyzed the reporting for signs of hidden bias.
Yeah. You got ground news for that
but such
now, I
earnest
guess.
instruction was to be no match for the powerful imagination
In no way.
of Edward Bernays.
I mean, the lies will definitely beat out the truth, will beat out
He was
people's...
about to help create a vision of the
amount of
utopia
time you
that
have in the day to
free-market
chase down the
capitalism
truth
would
next to
build
a
in America
scurrilous
if
lie.
it was unleashed.
Liars depend on that.
In 1939,
there it
New
is.
York hosted the World's Fair.
The World's Fair.
Edward Bernays was a central advisor. He insisted that the
Looks
theme be
Epcot-ish.
the link between democracy and American business.
Epcot was just like this,
At the heart
basically a
of the
World's
fair
Fair
was
in
a
a
giant
park
white dome
that was sponsored
that
by
Bernays named
so many major
Democracy.
corporations of America.
And the central exhibit was a vast working model of America's future, constructed by the General Motors Corporation.
To my father,
Tomorrowland.
the World's Fair was an opportunity to keep the status quo, that is, capitalism in a democracy. Democracy and capitalism, that marriage.
Chocolate and peanut butter.
Just like that.
You got peanut butter in my chocolate.
Manipulating people and getting them to think that you couldn't have real democracy in anything but a capitalist society.
Yeah, completely, Julie B. You got that.
Which was capable of doing anything, of creating these wonderful highways, of making, moving pictures inside everybody's house, of telephones that didn't need cords, of sleek roadsters. I mean, it was consumerist, but at the same time, you inferred that in a funny way, democracy and capitalism went together.
That's fascism, but...
The World's Fair was an extraordinary success and captured America's imagination.
See, I don't know. Are you making a fair choice anymore if the choice that you're making, you don't know the cost of it, you don't actually know what you're buying, you don't know the reason, right? But it's like being thrown into a dark room with a knife or a pistol and being told there's somebody dangerous in there. Something's going to fucking happen, but you're probably not going to be best directed or be, like, I don't know, completely informed about your decision. Is it really willful? Is it democracy anymore? If you don't know what these people are about, you don't even know what what elections are meant to be for, which is not to provide, like, democracy. It's to see what kind of business is going to be possible for the next 4 years. That's the main thing that's being decided. Who's going to get the good lay of the land? Who's going to get the good bits of the pig? So, sorry. Arr.
The vision it portrayed was of a new form of democracy, in which business responded to people's innermost desires in a way politicians could never do. But it was a form of democracy that depended on treating people not as active citizens as Roosevelt did, but as passive consumers. Because this, Bernays believed, was the key to control in a mass democracy.
Agreed.
It's not that the people are in charge, but that the people's desires are in charge.
Disgusting. It definitely works.
The people are not in charge. The people exercise no decision-making power within this environment.
Yeah, that's what I just said, basically.
Democracy is reduced from something which assumes an active citizenry to the idea of the public as passive consumers.
Yep.
Oh! Driven primarily by instinctual or unconscious desires.
That whole film clip, I'll dig it up. I know where to find that stuff.
You can get what
it's
you want.
Unreal.
But this struggle between the two views of human beings as to whether they were rational or irrational was about to be dramatically affected by events in Europe. Events that would also change the fortunes of the Freud family.
Quite seriously, yes.
In March 1938, the Nazis annexed Austria. It was called the Anschluss.
Yeah.
Hitler arrived in Vienna to an extraordinary outpouring of mass adulation. But even as he drove through the city, behind the scenes, the Nazis were systematically whipping up and unleashing the hatred of the crowd against the enemies of the new Greater Germany.
The Anschluss was a kind of explosion of terrible hatred against the enemies, the so-called enemies, or whatever they considered enemies, against the Jews totally, and also against a lot of very decent Austrians who had opposed the Nazis in Austria. They said it's legitimate, now you can do what you want, so they did it.
Yeah.
Stealing, robbing, and killing, I can't say it otherwise. And human depravity, of course, is always very near to normal behavior. It can change very quickly.
It does. Who's going to stop the mob? That's terrifying. That hatred is being
unleashed in our country. As the violence and assassinations
right
raged in Vienna, Freud decided he had to leave. His aim was to go to Britain, but he knew that Britain, like many countries, was refusing entry to most Jewish refugees.
Yep.
But help came from the leading psychoanalyst in Britain, Ernest Jones. He was in the same ice skating club as the Home Secretary, Sir Samuel Hoare, and Jones persuaded Hoare to issue Freud a British work permit.
That would work. The Home Secretary.
And in May 1938, Freud, his daughter Anna, and other members of his family set off for London.
Saved their
Freud
life.
arrived in London as Britain was preparing for war, and he settled with his daughter Anna in a house in Hampstead. But Freud's cancer was now far advanced, and in September 1939, just 3 weeks after the outbreak of war, he died. The Second World War would utterly transform the way governments saw democracy and the people they governed.
Absolutely.
Next week's program will show how the American government, as a result of the war, became convinced there were savage, dangerous forces hidden inside all human beings. Forces that needed to be controlled.
Everybody got real scared.
The terrible evidence from the death camps seemed to show what happened when these forces were unleashed.
The worst.
And politicians and planners in post-war America would come to believe that hidden under the surface of their own population were the same dangerous forces. And they would turn to the Freud family to help control this enemy within. And ever adaptable, Edward Bernays would work not just for the American government, but the CIA.
Because
and Sigmund Freud's daughter.
If you didn't already know, the advertising and public relations industry is directly connected to the business of nation states, the largest industrialists, financiers, famous people, right? So, the CIA. So, right. So if, say, the advertising company is working for, say, the State Department and trying to open up American business in emerging markets in, say, Central South America and or Africa, and so you could use them to, figure out what these people wanted and how to reach them, how to reach their minds and provoke desires in those populations for those clients and for the aims of the United States Department of State. And the back end dirty tricks going to work over your government so that it's really going to work, going to get the police on your side, going to blow up the competition, would be the CIA working in concert all together.
Daughter Anna would also become powerful in the United States because she believed that people could be taught to control the irrational forces within them. Out of this would come vast government programs to manage the inner psychological life of the masses.
Yeah, Anna, the daughter, is going to be the focus of the next one. So...
let's say a word about dreams.
Yes. All right. So that was part one of the Adam Curtis documentary, The Century of Self. That was fun hanging out with y'all and talking along and watching that. I've been a fan of that and a number of those other documentaries because I felt that better than most, he synthesized a number of these ideas, organized them in a way that was consumable all in one go, because otherwise it's reading Edward Bernays' books and the commentaries on them, reading Walter Lippmann's books and the commentaries on them, and the other luminaries of the day and historical events. See, I got into this stuff working backwards from Noam Chomsky. One of the most famous things that he ever did was a documentary that was the compendium, or I don't know, it, like showed parts of the book tour and a lot of the major ideas of the book that he co-wrote with another author called The Manufacturing of Consent, or Manufacturing Consent, which is directly talking about Walter Lippmann's ideas and Edward Bernays' ideas of controlling society by manufacturing in their minds the idea of them giving themselves over to these ideas, that you are forcing people into a chute where you know basically the outcome for enough of them is going to be this or that if you pose the questions and you make around it a bunch of pretenses and make the context such that it's obvious that it's going to be these things. And so this is also what people point out about the Hegelian dialectic, where you thesis, antithesis, synthesis, where if you can anticipate the antithesis, you're there, right? You can put forward a thesis statement and you can anticipate the synthesis and seem like a wizard if you know what the other side exactly is going to do. That's how you beat somebody in chess as well. But yeah, worked backwards from Noam Chomsky's commentary and criticism on Walter Lippmann and Edward Bernays, that he wrote that in 1989 and the documentary came out in 91. I probably found it in the late 90s or something when I was getting into Chomsky. Who was interesting, it was just like right down the road and summered in the same town that I did. Met him one time on the beach, but like when I was a kid, and I don't remember it. Yeah, that's how I got into that. Also, a member of my family was very, very high placed in this industry and had a front row seat to some of how the access that it can get you, the life, definitely how everybody wants to meet you, how you kind of, if you're running something like that, you have to know everything, like seemingly, culturally, psychologically, the cutting edge of all of these things, of all of the tastes, what's on the tip of everybody's tongue, what's on the tip of everybody's mind. If you're able to solve that in between somebody's desire and your client's product, like you got a hit. So from that perspective, I became really interested in this topic, and especially as I saw it control so much of our lives, so much of so many's lives, and it's hidden. Much of these forces are hidden. Many of these people, most have never heard of, less anything that they've done or said. And these concepts, these ideas, these structures that these people have set up, they run our lives. They run our lives. We think of these structures as inevitable, immovable. There's no way to get around them. They were artifices put up by these folk for these purposes. They're not as solid as people think. What it takes is being able to first understand, I think, and this is why I think this stuff is important. The first bit is that I find these systems to be a trap. I think this is what this documentary is also indicating, that it's a prison for your mind, and it's a prison for your mind that will take away your free will and leave you with nothing, leave you with slogans, leave you with empty promises for corporations who will only just sell you more stuff that's going to last kind of not as well as last year's and get worse and worse and worse as it goes forward. It seems to be the way it's going with our goods and with our throwaway society. And especially how, and I'm subject to all of these forces, by the way. I am a sucker for so many things. Like ads work on me. I have these desires that are placed in me, and I believe I'm operating under my own steam, and it's really somebody else's message or slogan. I believe everybody is subject to this to some degree. Buddhist monks are subject to this, and they would admit it. Probably easier than most. But I don't want anybody to think that like I'm some enlightened being and I'm beyond any of this stuff. No, I'm interested in it. I know that we're all subject to it, and I think it would be far less dangerous if more of us were aware that the choices that we think we are making are not really ours, and that we've been put up to a lot of the thoughts that we really have, and we might not even know, and especially you wouldn't know if you didn't look. And so I would say this is one of the places to look. And so I'm going to look some more. This was fun. Thanks for joining me, for hanging out into the witching hour on the Pacific Coast. Going to be doing some more of this, going to be doing some more of other stuff. I'm here in my studio, chilling out. Got a drum kit over there. Got this synthesizer. It's a nice synthesizer. Yeah, that's all right. Julie B, thanks so much. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too. Tell a friend. Yeah. Tell some people. Subscribe, I guess. Like and subscribe. Do what you want. Thanks, Witshare. You rock. You freaking rock. Look at this, Witshare. I mean, thank you for holding up being awesome and being weird and being witchy, so that we have a really good example of how to do it. You freaking rock. Absolutely. So yeah, people get unsubscribed, just if you just check. I'm sure y'all are. It's not a whole lot of you, so yeah, I just haven't been doing that. Witshare, you're gifting people memberships now? Well, y'all, if you just got a membership, let's see. All right. Kelly, you got one. Judy, you got one. Cajun, Rika's up in here. Stony Baloney. Some people who've been lurking got unlurked. All right. Absolutely awesome. Oh, thanks, Henny. Henny with the penny. Oh, guitar as well. Is that what you want? All right. Let's see. There it is. There it's visually. Is it even on? I don't know. Katana. I think it's on. Y'all hear that? Yeah, that's... I love a guitar. Yeah. Yeah, y'all. So I'll be going to be doing more musical type stuff around the place. It's all hanging out at the zoo with me here. So yeah, tune in for that. I'll drop a line about when I'm going to do part 2 of this, and come on back and we'll have another talk. Tell a friend. Go ahead if you want to watch ahead, and please, looking forward to have like comments and questions and a little bit more back and forth with y'all on these concepts. Go ahead if you want to watch ahead and you've got stuff to say, go on and say it. Really looking to try to provoke thought and have a conversation around these ideas. Okay, so I'm very bad at signing off. I'm signing off now. Very, very good night to you all. Looking forward to the next time. Be good. Be weird. With Sherry.